the word.
Okay, you ready? Or should we get started?
Sure.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to, resuming in our fall this year of our panels covering various urban design and planning topics. We're excited tonight to be joined by three excellent planners, designers, community engagement professionals to really talk about this subject, which is near and dear to all of our hearts and something which is inescapable in the work that we all do on behalf of ourselves, each other, and the larger communities that we work in, represent, and attempt to have meaningful dialogues with. I think now more than ever, in my own practice, and I think in everyone else's practices, we find ourselves at a critical sort of junction in terms of understanding what had been called sort of community engagement. And I think many of us, in the last 15 years or so, 20 years even, have really tried to explore new models for representing, understanding, engaging in dialogue with all of the people and places that we touch as professionals. It's become very difficult. It's become very difficult because we've at some points lost shared values. We have, I think, embraced or at least acknowledged the fact that some things will not right themselves and that there are systemic injustices and problems that are played out in urban form. And all of those things combined make for difficult conversations, but certainly also make for room for creativity across all sorts of spectrums in what we broadly call community engagement or planning and design practices on behalf of what we might call the larger publics. Tonight, we're joined by three really excellent, thoughtful practitioners who work in a variety of formats with communities and with planners across the United States to really deepen the dialogue and understand how we can be more effective and more meaningful and more thoughtful in the work that we all do. We're joined by Lensa Michel, founder, principal, and creative director of Powerful Pathways, Dan Doka, principal and co-founder of Interborough Partners, and Jennifer Lowe, the associate design director of Open Box. We're going to introduce each of our speakers and let them present a case study from their own work, as well as a foundational question that they have. And then we'll open it up for a larger dialogue and certainly have an opportunity for questions from all of you. So with that being said, Rami, do you want to introduce our first presenter? You're on mute. Still on mute.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Alenza is the founder of Powerful Pathways, a creative planning and design practice that works via a social equity lens. She is an urban planner, civic designer, artist, and intercultural facilitator with a background in community organizing and organizational development. Alenza brings 20 years of diverse experience in the public and nonprofit sectors at the local, national, and international levels in transportation policy, community development, education, economic and workforce development, organizational development, and food security. And as Martin suggested, we have asked, actually the speakers came up with this idea. Each speaker is going to sort of frame their discussion or their presentation with a question that they would like you to think about and perhaps answer, perhaps through the chat during the course of their presentation. Alenza's question is, to reframe how we think about design from a social equity lens means we have to challenge what we have learned and unlearn it. Are you ready to let go of the tools and approaches which have helped define you? Alenza?
Thanks, Rami. Hi, everyone. So I went back and forth if I should share slides, but I think I will share some slides because I'd like to talk about community engagement through a social equity and racial justice lens. And I think in order to do that, images sometimes might be really helpful in these instances. So I'm going to do a brief presentation, and then if there are other things that come up, we can talk about that in the discussion and any Q&A. So just let me know if you can see my screen well. Okay, so as Rami said, my name is Alenza Michelle, and I'm the founder and director of Powerful Pathways. We are a creative planning and design firm. And essentially, without going into all this text, what this really means is that we are a group that brings our work that intersects with urban planning, design, and creative placemaking. And in particular, we like to use media arts and technology through design thinking methods and principles, as well as a social equity lens to do our work. So what that translates to more readily is we do a lot of ethnographic informed policy research, intercultural community planning, creative community engagement and placekeeping, which is a variation on the term placemaking, which is more locally centered, community centered, human-centered design, programming, design, and implementation. And we also provide racial equity trainers to planners and designers. Why do we do this work? Well, essentially because we've heard we hear a lot of common things when working with our clients, and we primarily work with government agencies, social impact enterprises, and nonprofit organizations, groups that already consider themselves to be working in the social sector or in the impact space. But oftentimes we hear things like, we've always done it this way. So this attachment to old ways of doing things. This is just how cities are. What you're trying to do is too different, too new, too big. Let's focus on low-hanging fruit. So we want to be able to think about innovation and disruption really from a variety of different approaches. So essentially, we recognize that there's a lot of 18th century systems that we're still doing and to approach 22nd century innovation. And that's why I asked the question that I asked, which is, what are we willing to let go around modes or practices and what we have learned? What are we willing to unlearn so that we can do our work more equitably? So these are members of the team. We also have a myriad of associates and researchers that we work with, including some folks at the GSD. And these are some of the ways in which we do our engagement and civic design practice differently. So for example, this is actually a charrette, an image from a charrette we had done in Southwest Fresno, California. We were working on a project with the city of Fresno to reimagine brownfield sites. And these are sites, for those who may not be familiar, sites that are so blighted and dilapidated that they have become toxic, and the land and the sites need to be environmentally cleaned before there can be any redevelopment on them. But in particular, this was a community that's largely Mexican American and Hmong, and there's a history of distrust with the city and a lack of engagement and investment in the community. Within 4 blocks, there were over 20 brownfield sites that we had identified in our research. And so it was really hard for the city to reach the community members. So we decided to take a different approach and work through young people. And we did that by teaching the teens digital photography. I mentioned I'm an artist. I'm also, amongst the art that I do is landscape and urban photography. And so we train these teams to take pictures of these sites as they reimagine themselves, what they wanted to turn them into. And we did an exhibit, a community exhibit, which we're able to get the community to come out and take interest in the topic. And then we held this neighborhood charrette, which the EPA director, who actually attended the meeting, noted that this was probably the most youth-involved process she had ever been a part of. So some things about how we try to do this process of unlearning and do equity-centered work. Well, for one thing, we are people, our whole team are people who live from and are from and live on the margins. I myself grew up in Mattapan, Massachusetts, which is a neighborhood here in Boston. I still live here in Mattapan. And it was a community that was historically disinvested in, suffered from redlining and segregation. And now we're currently seeing a lot of rapid displacement taking place. Our practices are rooted in social justice. We bring that equity lens. We like to ask lovingly difficult questions, which means that we're not steering from courageous conversations. We're leaning into courageous conversations, but we've also learned how to pose those questions in ways that challenge the mind, but also open the heart. We embrace different ways of thinking, and we invite feedback loops, taking into design thinking approaches. We're doers, we get things done. We see systems through a design lens, and we're always interested in developing new strategies to address the work. And as a result, we tend to prioritize communities that are historically underserved or underinvested in. These are some of the samples of projects that we do, workshops and trainings, that we do. So we do everything from training around community engagement strategies, identifying scoping. We like to do practice design projects with community members to educate them about how a process works. We provide a lot of racial equity and intercultural training. And to some extent, we also do some business development workshops as well. These are some of our initiatives. I won't go into them. You can always check out our website to learn a little bit more. We have a new website actually that we've been building out, which has more information about these projects. This is a gentrification mapping tool that we're currently working on. We're working with the community leaders in Mattapan to develop an open source mapping project where we're tracking development. But more than that, we're also tracking stories. So we're pairing a lot of traditional quantitative land use data with qualitative community stories through oral histories, video and audio and video projects to capture images of neighborhood change. We recently started a microfinancing program for artists and creatives of color. These are other examples of research projects that we've done. This is focusing on social determinants of health. We've done some work in the Fairmount Corridor, which is the newly installed transit corridor in Boston that runs along Hyde Park, Mattapan, Dorchester, and Roxbury in Boston. These are some examples of other types of activities and workshops that we've done. We're currently doing some projects with a few bike share systems. We've done talks on the future of cities using smart technology. Trainings on community engagement, as I mentioned. Equity, cultural policy research. This is an image from a project we had done with MIT looking at bus rapid transit. And we worked with community members. So again, thinking about community engagement in a different way where we're empowering leaders. Rather than simply do community workshops where we had users test out this software that the MIT researchers developed, we hired and trained community members to learn how to then teach those workshops to other community members. And we actually had recruited a team of high school students to build out this 3D model map. It is actually an aerial projection, and the build out, we use Legos and had high school students build out the aerial map. So we got folks involved across all ages. This is from Go Boston 2030. We partnered with a group called Design Studio for Social Intervention. And rather than have a basic open house for the city's first citywide transportation planning process, we decided to transform a space in Chinatown into a giant game. So each of the pillars here that you see represent different stations. And as people walked in, we gave them tokens and they got to vote on different issues and aspects around transportation change that they'd like. This is some work we've done with the Fab Foundation, which is an international digital STEAM program that works for around 3D modeling and other types of cool technology. We do a lot of racial justice teach-ins, as I mentioned. This is another example of a talk that we did. This was from our Powerful Talks, which is a series of talks that we organize. Either we do it in-house or we partner with another organization. And we had speakers talk about shifts in transportation patterns during the time of COVID. We've also done some talks with that are specifically centering planners of color as we try to increase more diversity in the planning and design field. This is engaging artists. Artists can play a significant role in community development. And so we do a lot of work that centers around the arts and working with artists. And these are some events like the Forum on Engaging Immigrant Entrepreneurs, which we do biennially. We have a variety of different partners that we work with on a regular basis. And I can just get this to click, there we go. This is a local project that I started called Mattapan Open Streets, Open Studios. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of open studios, which is an idea that's over 30 years old here in Boston, where local galleries will open for a week or a weekend, and a variety of community events are centered around that to increase more foot traffic and promote local neighborhood amenities. Well, Mattapan has never had an open studios, largely because we don't have any gallery spaces. And that's, again, deeply rooted to its land use history and the redlining and segregation historical practices that have affected the community, even though there's a lot of artists here. So we decided to flip it on its head and turn this into an opportunity for civic design and neighborhood revitalization. So we're doing a variety of different public art projects, and we're partnering with local businesses and community centers to showcase artists' work and do various arts events. Here's some more pictures from Open Studios activities. This is a neighborhood design charrette where we had selected different sites around the neighborhood that we wanted to do pop-up activities, and had residents not only vote on which projects they wanted, but also to identify the sites that we should prioritize. This is for a collaborative project with a community garden. This was a local artist who had done this painting, and all community members contributed to it, so we co-sponsored this event. This is the Play Me, I'm Yours celebrity series pianos. You might have seen some of them in downtown Boston a couple summers ago. Well, we reached out to them and we said, we want to have a piano in Mattapan Square. And so we were able to get a piano, and then we organized several outdoor events around it and partnered with groups like Music Connects, which is a local youth music education program, to do some outdoors activities. This is actually the community room of a police station, and we turned it into a pop-up Haitian artists art show because, as some of you may know, Mattapan has a strong Haitian community. This is an example of a design thinking exercise we had done, rethinking policy. So we there's been a growing amount of national attention and interest around lowering the voting age from 18 to 16. I mean, the idea being that young people are actually more active in their communities and then become disenfranchised when they go off to college. So how do we get them involved in civic engagement and policy, and interested in local policy before they take off? So this is just an example of the kind of brainstorming and processing that we do through a design thinking process. This is from an event with the City of Boston. And these are some of our big picture social change goals that we enact through our work. We focus on inclusive civic engagement, meaning we like to bring people that are on the table at the table. Oftentimes, marginalized populations are being talked about by decision makers, but they're not in the room, so we bring them directly to the room. Open participatory process. We think about accessibility and concepts around popular education, which is this idea that everyone can be an expert. There's no specific idea of a hierarchy. Everybody brings something to the conversation. Redesign and dismantling systems as we navigate existing ones. It's not simply about navigating inequitable systems, we're also trying to reframe the way people think so that those systems can change. And then progressive community engagement, or another way to think about it is community development. Another way to think about it is reparative planning. This idea that we're using planning to repair some of the legacy and of loss and harm that unfortunately our field has contributed to. And we have to acknowledge that and name that so that the work that we're doing is really in essence undoing some of the damage that has been done in our past. And so we do that using an equity framework and fostering cultural, cross-cultural learning and engagement. So the last thing I just want to leave you with is this question. It's actually from Go Boston 2030 from the open house that I mentioned earlier. It's a question that I like to share because I think it helps us just doing that kind of unlearning or reframing of thinking. And the question is, what if we could better connect our neighborhoods by train without going downtown? And it's a fundamental question because a lot of our transit systems, virtually all of our transit systems, rapid rail in particular, are downtown centric. The assumption that downtowns are where all of the activities are. And it also contributes to the idea as to why when we see through this history of segregation practices, most marginalized communities are on the outskirts of a geographic, city's geographic boundary. So those communities become transit deserts and lack transit options. So what if we were to find ways to connect them without having to go downtown? So again, it's sort of concept of reframing. So thank you very much for listening.
That's excellent. Thanks so much, Alanzana. I think we'll follow up with some questions a little bit later on with that. And I'm particularly interested in sort of getting your view on how artists help you to sort of expand the dialogue that you have with these communities by speaking sort of a different parallel language and allowing for different entry points. But we'll come back to that a little bit. So thank you so much for that. Super, very, very interesting. It was really good. So our next presenter here is Jen Lowe. Jen's an integrative designer, educator, and landscape architect with over 13 years of experience in the planning and design of public spaces across New York, California, and Washington. At Open Box, Jen is interested in the intersection of human-centered design and the built environment and sees both participatory design research and the power of place as key tools to advance our work towards justice and equity. Jen holds a BLA from the University of Washington and an MDes in integrative design from the Stamp School of Art and Design at the University of Michigan. So Jen, welcome, thanks.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks everyone for having me today. I'm really excited to be in conversation with Alenza and Dan this evening. So I think I have a driving question too, to sort of put out into the ether to the audience to consider. What is the role of design in community engagement? So just think about it. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. So first I'll tell you a little bit about Open Box as a studio. We are an interdisciplinary Black and women-led studio of diverse lived experience, composed of a creative team of researchers, designers, urbanists, activists, and educators. And our studio is located in Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn, which sits on the unceded land of the Lenape people. Red Hook is also the home to New York's first Puerto Rican neighborhoods, Brooklyn's largest public housing development, and is also a place of intense climate vulnerability. And what we do in our studio, we design for people, cities, and planets at the intersections. And we really bring lived experience directly to the designer's table. Our version of a community engagement, it's not a couple of post-it note workshop sessions, but really we're looking to construct them as entire phases of work that integrate and deepen planning and design processes. So we do this by applying deep qualitative research methods to engage with communities, to surface lived experience, have better conversations, sort of surface visions, aspirations, and needs. And most importantly, we, as researchers, we synthesize these learnings into actionable insights, design principles and opportunities and outcomes. And we also see that, skipping ahead. We also see community engagement as a start to a relationship. It's not just an event. It's about rapport building and opportunity to have better conversations and deeper conversations, and offer opportunities to enable trust building, or even when it comes down to it, also trust repair in some instances through these processes. And we'll continue to unpack some of these methods further, but again, I think you'll continue to see some things that emerge amongst the three of us in terms of ethnographic research, how we're using prototypes, objects to have conversations, tours. We have this concept of intercepts too, which is kind of a person on the streets to interact with folks live and in person. And I guess first we'll sort of look at OpenBox through the lens of like one of our approaches, particularly to designing for justice. And over the past year, we've kind of collectively as a team have started to unpack this into 5 principles for us in doing this work. And that's 1, centering communities and not individuals. 2, design how and why, not just what. 3, honor lived experience over design expertise. 4, excellence without supremacy. And 5, it will always be a work in progress. So the first, centering communities and not individuals. At OpenBox, we centered the collective good and not individual benefits. And so that requires new systems and processes to be built and designed to disconnect from the status quo processes that cater to individual exclusionary interests. And so some considerations on how we do this, we think of like community ecosystems are the unit of sustainable living and those interconnections. And that local development and knowledge sharing builds power within local communities. And the how and why becomes really fundamental to our work, where we don't focus on what just gets built from a project by project basis, but we're designing for ever evolving possibilities over sort of a very extended long-term trajectory that's sustainable, that's adaptable, that is deep and it grows. And for also designing sort of enabling processes for how and why people come together long after designer is really out of the picture. And who becomes a really important question that demands specificity in enabling this work. We recognize that communities are dynamic systems. People, identities, and cultures are fluid and intersecting. And there's so many communities within a community that there's also shared values and then also points of conflict to recognize. So within this space, we consider how the design of shared spaces informs how we choose to come together and what we imagine what we can become and what is possible. And then also definitions, language and definitions also become really important together moving forward amongst stakeholders, users, and community members in order to surface new possibilities. The third principle, honor lived experience over design expertise. People in their communities, and we've already heard this, people in their communities are experts of their lived experience, and they provide local contextual insight and define a community's terms of engagement. So we create space for people to share their own modes of participation and to really try to uplift what is already happening and working in communities and not building from scratch. So we're really trying to consider sort of opportunities to design that amplifies local stories and empowers community members. And then also how understanding and unpacking communities, how they interpret like signals of welcome and belonging through design cues that they experience too. So we're doing an amount of also translation between the two. And the fourth, excellence without supremacy. So we understand that supremacy narrowly defines what excellence and success can look like. And as a result, power, resources, and opportunities are stockpiled for some at the exclusion of many. So removing supremacy means democratizing who defines, measures, and enjoys design excellence. And so we do this by, carving out and cultivating inclusive definitions of language, metrics, and standards that are valuable design outcomes and metrics of impact and importance to folks. And also, like, we talk a lot about sustainability in our work and about climate action and what kind of infrastructure that entails, but those conversations can't happen unless, we're investing in and talking about racial and economic equity in that work as well. And our fifth principle, it will always be a work in progress. So justice is an ongoing process, not an outcome. And that goes with equity work as well. It's not a checklist. So we have to consider that this is a project, but where is this project within the larger ecosystem and the trajectory and connect it to these larger visions and sort of, these transformations for change that we're looking towards. So we really are trying to consider how inclusive design processes increase the potential for equitable outgrowths, and ongoing care for relationships and partnerships is part of the design process. So much is about sort of the person-to-person interactions or group-to-group interactions, and what we are cultivating is a lot of what we work on and think about in our studio. And so what does this all really look like in application to our work? I'll offer just like one case study as sort of a very small lens. I'm a landscape architect, but this is actually inside of a building. So I have a level of discomfort, but it does kind of unpack it kind of in a small way. Sort of some of the processes that we work through at OpenBox. And this is with the kind of the question of how might we champion local voices in exhibition design? And this was at a project in partnership with Studio Joseph, ProLocate, a few other sort of design team members for the MLK Junior Memorial Library in Washington, DC. And this is very much a storytelling sort of project. It's about exhibit design, but at the very front end, how we tell stories about our histories, about our places, about our narratives, are at a very early step about how we can imagine and shape our neighborhoods and our cities as well. So I really, as we go through this sort of case study, I'm going to be pointing out sort of points of connections all along the design process that consider to inform and deepen our design and planning inspirations, motivations, and decisions through our sort of modes and methods of community engagement. So this was a modernization too. It was like a larger renovation of this museum, and we were tasked to ensure that the design of this exhibit specifically met the needs and hopes of community members. So DC Public Library sought OpenBox to engage them through an intensive community engagement and research process. And a lot of some of these words will probably be very familiar in terms of prototyping and design, but really core to the beginning of our process is alignment. So with understanding and who's at the table with the existing sort of stakeholder group of project stakeholders, what is the gap of our understanding before we proceed into sort of design work? So we do have these alignment exercises and conversations and workshops to align vision, goals, and key audiences that are really important to be at the table before we proceed. And then core to the early research that we do is we call it the community research. I mean, we call it research. Stories, people's conversations, the interviews, who we engage with, that is core to our research. And through this lens, we are trying to identify even early on about content, major exhibit themes and interactions to provide really sharp sort of specific directives for the design through the eyes of local DC residents. And we used prototyping in many ways, from sort of like much more sort of low fidelity things to higher fidelity things to get sort of insights from and feedback loops with community members. And of course, all of that sort of feeds and is translated into these design outcomes with the larger design team. And within the context of this project, how we identified key audiences was particular to, what was reoccurring in conversations, who was being brought up the most, what was the particular needs and sort of audiences that were that had particular sort of direct utility and use of these spaces, and also the amplification potential, who can really sort of, be able to, this could sort of like build and grow beyond exhibits, and who are sort of the culture bearers and also key sort of community leaders that we really should be involved in this. And so we thought it was teens, longtime residents, and sort of the creative community. And across sort of our early sort of research in order to do this, it was really trying to surface community needs through generative methods and activities. And in these early sort of weeks, we visited DC museums and cultural institutions to observe the landscape of exhibit design in the city. We created interactive installations such as graffiti walls inside the museum and also the library to understand how does the community perceive the role of the library. And what we conducted, as I mentioned earlier, intercept interviews with museum patrons. So we're, spending a day to kind of come up to different community members to ask questions. What makes an exhibit experience compelling or not? And also co-creation, or we also kind of call them sort of like co-creation or prototype sort of opportunities of what makes a DC story. In particular, this is a bottle of Mambo sauce, who was connected to Mambo sauce to DC story and identity, and those who did not, and why so. And so from this early research and insights, we developed the following design principles for the development of exhibit concepts moving forward. One was cultivate belonging. The exhibit must proactively countervail the widespread exclusion of Black DC residents to demonstrate they are welcome and the space is intended for them. Two, celebrate living culture, to acknowledge that Chocolate City is not erased and honor the significance of Black culture in DC. The exhibit should represent a culture that continues to live and breathe rather than as a relic of the past. The third was ground in the everyday, leverage the relatability of everyday stories to engage people with history and more readily apply lessons to the present. Four, facilitate dialogue that empowers displaced voices. Gentrification, like the city that you are in and in DC especially, is very visceral. So how do we elevate the concerns of the impacted communities with those who are impacting them? And five, equip for endurance. Providing practical capacity building and emotional support for people seeking to uplift themselves and their communities. And then we got into sort of the nitty gritty and the physical and sort of visual aspects of the prototyping process. So, we came up with very sort of rougher versions of these mocked up exhibits to get initial reactions and takeaways, but also talk about conversations about tone and language. What questions become unanswered based on sort of the given narratives or stories that are being told in sort of these early versions? And what are sort of key responses and reactions to the images that are being curated so far? And we also use these prototypes too to really have conversations around the type of content and perspectives on local DC issues and topics. So, which included Mayor Marion Barry, Go-Go Museum, MLK and the Poor People's Campaign, and testing of the interactive modes and features and its potential in the exhibits with participants. The following sort of images are sort of like those live mocked up conversations. We have these boards, we're coming up to folks, we're having conversations, getting sort of their feels about things. Questions that came up with Marion Barry, which is, he has no lack of stories and histories within the city, and a very prominent local politician and activist, and identity is synonymous with Washington, DC. it was important to understand what angles on the Barry story resonated, how do people react to first person stories, also through audio, so in terms of the very like technical aspects, and how we might solicit stories from the community and make these much more participatory efforts. And go-go music. What about DC music? Are visitors really interested in learning? And what musical experiences within this context might be more engaging? And this is sort of like a little snapshot of all of the folks that we talked to. And I don't want to say that like the numbers like are like exceptionally important. I think what is really important is that, you know, we have some quantitative measures to keep track of, but we want to point out that there is depth and quality of interactions that must be curated and designed and all throughout this. So this is sort of one plan that we did, and that is very specific to what were the needs of this particular project. In order to have sort of better conversations and accessible conversations too. And the outcome. So this is after 8 months of multiple phases of design research and prototyping of exhibit concepts with community members. We delivered a blueprints and a guidebook that provides a framework for community engagement and a 5-year plans for all key exhibit experiences to sustain and elevate a community-centered exhibit within the MLK library. And I think the exhibit officially opened this weekend. So for all of you who appreciate or love DC's local history, or, you know, it may, you know, a lot of this history may be invisible to you, I really recommend a visit when you should be in town. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen. I'm keeping my camera off because I have not the greatest reception at the moment. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear great.
Okay. All right. Our third speaker is Dan Doka, an associate professor in practice and urban planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and principal and co-founder of Interborough Partners, a New York-based architecture, urban design, and planning firm that has won many awards for their participatory place-based projects. Most recently, Interborough's Campau Davison Banglatown neighborhood framework plan in Detroit won both a regional and urban design award from the American Institute of Architects and a gold achievement award from the American Planning Association. A second paperback edition of Interborough's book, The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion, was released in 2021. Dan, would you like to ask your own question?
Yeah, my question, I think, had to do with what different roles we can do as people who are doing community engagement. Let's keep that in mind. Let me say it's a pleasure to share the stage with Alenza and Jen. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this event. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we do over at Interborough. For that, I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so, well, Interborough, those are my two partners who will be familiar to Martin, because Martin was our professor many years ago. So that's Georgine Theodore on the left and Tobias Armborst. And quick overview of what we do at Interborough. We really focus on inclusive architecture, urban planning, and urban design. Really do maybe 4 different things. I think on the first hand, we design public spaces, inclusive public spaces that try to bring different people together. We do a lot of planning, so regional, citywide, neighborhood planning. We also make a lot of curricular materials, sometimes for plans we're working on, sometimes not. Then we write and do research. So, for example, there's a book we published a couple of years ago called The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion. All these projects were done with a lot of participation, which is what we're here to talk about today. We actually go through a lot of trouble to get people to talk to us. So here's, for example, a table we made to get people to tell us what's right and wrong with Cambridge. So we took it around the city, you could write on it, and yielded all kinds of interesting insights. This is a puzzle that's meant to give us people's preferences for what to do with land suddenly made available by a freeway removal. Here's a crazy model of Newark, New Jersey that we projected on. There's another crazy model of Newark, New Jersey. This is a game that lets people reimagine what to do with the space in a right-of-way. Here's a game that lets people think about what to do with vacant land. There's a color forms activity we made to give us ideas about what to do when we were designing a natural playscape in St. Louis. For this neighborhood plan in Detroit, we took over an ice cream truck. We basically gave kids free ice cream for input. Board games. We make a lot of kind of educational board games and things, teach people about land use, empower people with knowledge about the planning process. We do make a lot of newspapers. Here's one we made in Detroit that is meant to describe some of the changes that were made as part of a redo of the zoning code in Detroit. I'm not going to go through any of these in too much detail. Here's a newspaper we made in Cambridge. And part of the reasons why we do these newspapers is to keep people engaged in the planning process. This was for a citywide plan we did here in Cambridge. Contains all kinds of features. For example, all kinds of experts weighing in on what a comprehensive plan could or should do for Cambridge, but also interviews with people on the street and stuff. Also, here on the fun and games page, a primer on zoning, but in a fun way. Comic books, workshops, exhibitions, you name it. We do whatever we can to get people to talk to us. In fact, we do in community engagement even when we don't have to. So many years ago, for example, we did a project called Holding Pattern. This was for the MoMA PS1 Museum in Queens. This is the museum, and they basically invited us to do a temporary installation in this courtyard you see in the foreground. And when we were thinking about what to do, we were just walking around the neighborhood talking to people who lived in the shadow of this museum. And we had this epiphany that a lot of people who lived near the museum, for example, here's a guy who ran a taxi business. It's not there anymore, but he had basically made this little pavilion in the front of his business where he had chairs for the drivers and some plants and a shade canopy. Well, these are all the things that they were asking us to do in the courtyard. Basically provide some seating and some shade for a temporary summer environment. So we had an idea that what we would do for this project was just ask people in the neighborhood what they needed for their business or their school or their senior center or their daycare center. And we would design those things for them, but we would put them in the courtyard for the summer so that they'd be the kind of elements of this design. So talking to somebody who wanted a ballet mirror, or somebody who wanted some outdoor furniture. This was someone who was right across the street from the MoMA PS1 Museum, or some kids who wanted a rock climbing wall. So we ended up just walking around and talking to, 200 people in the neighborhood, trying to make matches, things that would be that people would want, but that would also be fun in the courtyard during the summer. So in the end, this is all the stuff we made, and this is all the locations where all the stuff we made went when the project was over. Again, it was a temporary project. So this is what it looked like. People wanted lifeguard chairs and swimming pools and benches and misting stages and chaise lounges and all this stuff. So we didn't pick any of these elements. The people in the community picked them. We just made them, held them in the courtyard for a summer so that people would have a fun place to hang out. And then at the end of the summer, we gave these things back to people. The point though, so here are these kind of oversized museum labels that we made as a means of saying why, for example, there was a pool in this courtyard and where it would go when the project was done, right? Always trying to make a connection between the inside of the courtyard and the outside of the courtyard. Have these little tags and things. So, you know, the guy who wanted the ballet mirror, here they are installed in the museum, and then here they are installed in his ballet studio after the project. Remember our friend Ozzy, who wanted some furniture and some trees for his new Teamster Union courtyard. Well, here are the trees in the holding pattern in the museum. And then here we are installing our first tree in Ozzy's courtyard. Remember these kids who wanted the rock climbing wall. Here's the rock climbing wall in holding pattern in the installation. And then here it is installed at the daycare center. What does it mean? It's kind of building a bridge between an institution and people outside of that institution. Many of these people that we worked with had never actually been to the museum, even though it was in some cases right across the street. So that's that project. And I think that this kind of engagement, really direct with a really immediate payback, I think we got really interested in that. And we basically took that approach for a newer project, the project that just opened this summer. This is a 18-acre nature playscape in St. Louis's Forest Park. Nature playscape is basically a playground without playground equipment. And it's meant to get kids into nature by kind of encouraging them to play with natural elements. The scheme is a kind of pearl on a necklace scheme. So we link distinct play areas, each based on a different ecological theme with an ADA accessible path. So, you know, there's gravel banks and meadows and mound areas and wetlands and things like that. Well, this being a place for kids, we wanted to enlist kids to help us design it. So we basically designed a mobile engagement station and made a kind of this color forms activity. I alluded to it earlier. And we basically just asked kids to collage. We took pictures of the site before the design, and we said, just tell us what looks like fun. And of course, they came up with all kinds of crazy ideas. I mean, things that were way more interesting than we could have ever imagined or drawn, right? I mean, you see these kind of crazy things with like upside down trees and sticking out of rocks and whatever. And basically, to make a long story short for the project, we just built these things. We just literally took them and built them. So everything that's in this playscape now is just something that a kid designed. And again, like with the holding pattern project, the idea is get people to take ownership of a space by being authors of that space. The idea was to really build in a kind of constituency for the park by creating authors of people who, by creating authors, right? So that was the idea there. Here, these are just some pictures from opening day. So I want to talk about one more project, and it's an old one that turned into a new one. And it's so 15 years ago, we went to Detroit and we did a kind of speculative project, part of a competition. And it's a project called Improve Your Lot. And basically we went to Detroit and we did this kind of ethnographic study of how people who stuck it out in Detroit were starting to spread out. They were starting to take land to the left, to the right, and create these larger kind of suburban scaled lots that we call the blot. Sometimes they'd buy them, sometimes they'd just put a fence around it and take it, because this is Detroit in 2003, and you could do that kind of thing. And the project was really just kind of trying to understand the impact of this, how what people were doing entirely out of self-interest was changing the DNA of the city. So that you went from a city like a regular grid that had been platted to something like you see on the right, which is a very irregular kind of city. So people are changing the DNA of the city. We thought that was interesting and really worth paying attention to. And so we did this kind of ethnographic study, and we just started to draw examples of these kind of side lot accumulations. We call them blots. And we started to just meet people who were acquiring land in this way and just tell a story about what they were doing. And we found that it was actually a pretty compelling response to depopulation and disinvestment, and one that was entirely unplanned and entirely overlooked. So we ended up telling a lot of stories in this project. I'm not going to go to it in much detail. Now, fast forward to 2 years ago, we were invited back to Detroit in an official capacity, and we were invited to do a neighborhood plan for a neighborhood called Camp Out Davison Banglatown. I know that's a mouthful. It's an extremely diverse area with a mix of longtime Black and white residents, multiple generations of immigrants from Bangladesh, Yemen, and the Balkans, growing community of young artists, and so on and so forth. You know, so this is basically, we're looking at housing and economic development, open space, streetscaping, and so on. So it's a framework plan, but I want to get back to blotting, what I was just talking about, this thing that we looked at earlier on. That came, by the way, out of observation, which is a different, somewhat different than engagement, but I would argue equally important, critical engagement. Well, in this case, this is the neighborhood, and here are all the vacant lots in the neighborhood. And so here are the parcels. Here are all the parcels that are owned by the Detroit Land Bank, a lot of publicly owned land. Of those, these are the ones that are blots. That is the dark green. These are lots where people have expanded their lot by grabbing the lot to the left or to the right. But beyond that, there's also a lot of land stewardship. So neighbors don't just buy or appropriate properties. They take care of them for one reason or another. They mow the lawn, they clean up trash or whatever. That's these parcels here. So we just started to tell stories about stewardship, about how people take care of land, like Lonnie and Mike, who were cousins, long-term residents. They took over this corner. And so this is their corner store. But they don't own the 3 other lots on the corner, but they maintain them. They keep them clear of trash. They have community barbecues, and you know, they've got a basketball hoop and stuff. So it becomes this kind of community node. So we started to look at different examples of how people were being stewards of land that they didn't own. This is an interesting one. This is in green, the New Hope Islamic Community Center, which is in a reused commercial space. And what was really interesting is over time, as the constituency or the congregation grew, they bought adjacent vacant land to add to community activities based on things that people wanted to do. So one of the pieces got turned into a soccer field, and just gradually, the New Hope was able to expand in this kind of piecemeal way. And so it became this important community node actually for the large Bangladeshi community there. And this kind of new civic institution emerged out of this combination of a kind of broadly framed mission to do good on the one hand, but also just the pragmatics of grabbing land as it becomes available, and finding good ways to put it to use. So, you know, we looked at lots of examples. This is the Bandu Gardens, and this is the skate park that was really interesting. And so we were just looking at the ways that people were becoming stewards of this land. The way we were doing this was by observation, but doing the same kind of stuff that my colleagues do. Mapping workshops, getting people to talk, finding interesting ways for people to talk about the land, getting kids to talk about vacant land, finding people in the community to really take us in and take us on tours, having lots of different focus groups, make sure we hear from lots of different people, keeping people you know, in the loop with a newsletter, our ice cream truck, which I showed you earlier. This gives you insights into a neighborhood that you wouldn't get if you were to just look at a map, right? We wouldn't have learned about New Hope. We wouldn't have learned about Bandu Gardens or any of these places had we just looked at a map. It was really important to be able to observe, to see the site, to see these spaces through the eyes of people who live there. And because of that, we were able to make proposals that were very site specific and worked for the people who live there. So just one example is, you remember all those vacant lots. We actually proposed that the lots that were stewarded actually be set aside and given to people who were taking ownership of them. We also proposed, and I'm just about done, I know I'm out of time. We also proposed a bundling program. So instead of the city just getting rid of lot by lot, that they would package lots with houses of really different sizes to allow for different kinds of people to come into the neighborhood who might have different needs. This was all based on our kind of study of blotting. So I'll stop there, but it's a kind of example, I think, of why it's really important to really get into the nitty gritty and really see the neighborhood through the eyes of people. It's interesting, it's surprising, but it's also important because it really encourages you and forces you to make proposals that are really site specific and work for people who live there. I'm done, thanks.
That's excellent. Thanks so much, all three of you. Fantastic, presentations and lots of sort of insights, coming through all of the work. I mean, I really appreciate in all the presentations sort of the spirit of experimentation and the willingness to sort of talk new languages in a way. And I guess just as a question to sort of bring it full circle back to Alenza, and I saw aspects of this also, Dan, in your work, the idea of sort of creativity and art. And I know, Alenza, you said that you were an artist and a visual artist, working both in landscape and photography. And so can you talk a little bit about how that helps you, maybe break down barriers or speak a different language that frees up the creative process. And Dan as well, I know, you all come at your work as architects and urban designers in a way, but also as experientialists, I guess is a word. And think about, sort of the idea of play and movement and, meeting people where they are through different means. But Alenza?
Yeah, great question, Martin. I think for me, as an urban planner and a civic designer, I really lean on my artist hat because precisely as you described, around this concept of experimentation, that is a core role that artists play. And when I'm working with clients, that's how I often describe projects that we do. Like, when given a project, we've got to scope it out, and everything needs to be defined. And there's this sort of process where, you submit your draft to the client and then they send you feedback like, this is how we want things to go. But when you're talking about community engaged processes, there's so much unknown. There's so much opportunity for surprise. And that should be embraced as a positive, as a good thing. That we find ourselves sort of moving away from a lot of things that kind of box us in this sort of risk averse mindset, and instead we move towards an experimental mindset. Like, we're going to pilot and play around with a couple different ways to get the community involved, and we're okay with that. And so part of it is just kind of giving the heads up to the client to say, we're asking for this budget. Some of it is finite, but we're going to need some funding here that's really just allows us to do some play space and try out different things. And in most cases, that means we're going to utilize different forms of artistic practice to help facilitate conversations across cultural groups, because art brings people together across cultures. And other times it could be things like gamification. I really like that, seeing that in both Jen and Daniel's presentations, because I really identify with that. We just recently did a workshop, racial justice training for a municipality, and we had 60 participants. So we turned it into a Jeopardy game and had them play along and be able to sort of work through sometimes really difficult or heavy content by using that bridge. So I think, making use of media arts and technology and just various different mediums around the arts really creates that space for experimentation.
That's great. I see that there's, again, so I don't want to take up all the space here. So there's a couple of questions coming in, and I believe Lindsay, you had a question that you wanted to ask, so please do.
I did. Thank you so much. So my name is Lindsay. I'm from Winnie Vegas Architectural Products. We're a signage firm based in Needham. So I had a question specifically about community inclusion. So I'm new to our company. I worked at Poblocki before, and so our community inclusion was pretty limited. What I'm trying to accomplish now is specifically that interaction with the community. And I guess my question more or less pertains to Alenza, if I'm saying your name correctly. I really want to get involved with tech high schools. What would you suggest is the best method of going about that?
That's a really interesting question, Lindsay. Thanks for asking. I think I would want to, like, if you and I were having a one-on-one conversation, I would want to probe a little bit more to kind of understand the why and who is your audience at the school. Is it the faculty? Is it the students? Or are you really sort of interested more in like reframing
specifically, I guess specifically is, so you were talking a lot about getting kids involved, things of that nature. And what I was formerly trained in being an art teacher, so that's my form. But what I would like to do is I see a lot of kids come along and they would like to get involved, and I live in New Bedford now, so this particularly pertains to New Bedford, I guess, because I'm having a hard time trying to figure out how to get involved with the minority community how do I benefit this community? How do I help them as you are helping your community?
I see. Thanks for that clarification. I think if you want to get connected to students, the schools can be certainly one way, but I actually find that schools are very rigid. There's a very regimented schedule. There's so much politics around school access these days. You got to go through a whole series of loops and certifications and regulations when you finally get into the school system. So one entryway could be through out of school time programs, which you may or may not have to do that at the high school site itself, but you can still attract high school students to that program. So if you were to pitch an out of school time program to the administration, they could help you recruit students to participate in it. And that way, that could be one entryway to begin to engage students. And it is always good to think about that. I really like working with high school students because before I studied urban planning, I mentioned I was a community organizer, and a lot of the work that I did was organizing around children, youth, and family policy issues. So I worked a lot with youth, and I spent 4 years working with the City of Cambridge's Kids Council, which is now known as the Mayor's Youth Council. So we did a lot of projects that focused on local policy, but through the eyes of young people. And most of it was just asking them what they wanted to see and what they wanted to work on, and then coming up with programming that met those needs.
Thank you so much.
Jessica, did you have a question?
I did. Yeah. Thank you
Great.
so much for organizing this. I mean, all three presentations were incredible. I really appreciate it. And, I'm just kind of struck by this thought that I've heard that term placekeeping before, and I feel like that's really important to keep in mind. And it just sort of occurred to me that like when you design these public spaces without asking people, it's essentially like colonization. You're like, here's this awesome thing that you need, and like, here you go. And like, without asking people, you really don't know. And so I guess my question is, how do you convince people to take the time and pay the money to do this? I mean, I think that we as designers often just have to respond to the task we've been given, and there's some room to give suggestions. And maybe for Martin and Rami, like people are coming to them because they bring that level of design, and to you guys specifically. But for the rest of us, I think what would you say as like a, I don't know, just to really bring it back to like maybe the ROI or whatever you want to, like, how do you convince people to take the time and spend a little money doing this process? Because it's so important. And like, I mean, I feel like every project should have some process, public process, but it doesn't always beyond like the typical things. Also, ice cream truck, brilliant. Like, what better way to get people to talk to you than give them ice cream? I mean, that's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. I mean, I'll say real quick that I think things are getting a little bit better. As someone who spends a good chunk of my time reading and responding to RFPs, requests for proposals, I mean, I think that over the last couple of years, I feel like the engagement scope for most projects has increased, and the budgets have increased somewhat too for engagement. So I think that most clients get it, at least in the public sector. All our work is public sector work. And so I'm not going to say it's enough, but I think it's getting better. There's an expectation that you do some kind of creative engagement. In fact, most RFPs you look at explicitly say, we want some kind of creative engagement. We don't want, just a meeting one afternoon in an auditorium. So I think it's getting better. Somehow I think a lot of clients have gotten the message that it's important.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think everyone desires to have processes where, where there's, alignments, we have sort of shared interests that we can sort of, accelerate sort of certain initiatives or projects or, visions together. And, we have a lot of evidence now, like we need to build relationships. We need to build relationships that are beyond sort of the consultant teams, because we know that we build relationships with our clients. We build relationships with each other across like some consultant teams, and why it's sort of this other, communities who are most directly impacted are not part of that decision-making process. So, and then also, I think everyone has had it with, sort of more conventional or limited forms of engagement that have bred a lot of mistrust. And I think, everyone is, does not desire that anymore. So there's, an alternative that must be discovered, explored. And we can also align it with, other industries in design that use user research, very transactional ways, but that is fundamental to their processes. And, I think we do talk about people, but have not, put a value to that type of work that does get better results, and outcomes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add to that really quickly that I would totally agree with Jen and Daniel, and say, I think I'm a believer that everyone has good intentions, but we also, our default is that we operate on our biases. And the bias that often I think gets in the way when coming up with project budgets is that, you know, community engagement is secondary or tertiary to the project goal. And then sometimes it becomes a side thing or an add-on, or it's like, we'll do community engagement for phase 1, and then we've talked to the community and that's it, and then we'll never talk to the community again, as opposed to creating this space for like feedback loops and to make sure that we're still on track with what the community identified. Even when there's a community engaged process, there seems to be some kind of limitation to it. So part of reframing our thinking also means sort of rethinking how we would go about with any stage or phase of a process. And I think that also means we need to kind of retool how we look at, or how we would approach community engagement as well, and budget for that in advance, so that when new surprises come along, which there will be, if you do community engagement really well, you're bound to discover things that you had no idea about a community before. And in those instances, you're going to need a cushion of funds and resources to address those surprises. So, and I think by being able to acknowledge that and even sharing that with the community, they will then be more responsive, because they will see that their input is being taken into account in a way that has greater depth than they've experienced before.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved what you were saying about ownership, Daniel. And I think that's an authorship. I think that's really the key. Sorry, just a quick recap question. I wonder if any of you have been asked to do a post survey, you know, kind of like a pre and post, the way you would. I come from more arts and healthcare sort of side, and we do a lot of that. Like, did we actually make an impact, you know, sort of thing. And if you get involved with that, then I'll let people talk. Sorry.
Sort of our post-occupancy evaluation, you know, and did you make an impact, and can you, is it tangible, and is it measurable? That's, you know, I don't know, the three could answer whether they've been asked to sort of follow up after projects to see what sort of differences were made by the projects. Good question. That being said, I know Ben has a question also. So Ben, happy to hear your question. Thanks.
Thank you, all the presenters. I was curious if any of these creative engagement sort of processes have taken on a life of their own that goes beyond the project. And there are certainly, you've shown great examples of useful products, play structures, seats, installations that certainly endure. But is there a program side to that as well? I'm curious if community members or organizations continue some of the activities that you introduce into a community in a way that continues those dialogues.
I will try to answer your question, Ben, as well as Jessica's. I think in terms of lasting effect, it's a little hard to gauge because we don't always do a post-evaluation. I wish we could do that more, but oftentimes it's just if we're doing a project through a client, if that's not in their purview, if they don't sort of see that as valuable, they don't often request that or push for it when we suggest it. For our own projects that we do in-house, we do try to create space for follow-up, and that can be a myriad of things. In some cases, it can be a formal pre and post survey. We often do preliminary kinds of different methods for inquiry in intake, and then we do a follow-up. In other cases, it could be something in the form of a focus group or just doing sort of more organizing style engagement, like going door to door, walking around the community. For example, last year, since we were unable to do projects for Mattapan Open Streets, Open Studios, due to the pandemic, we decided instead to more informally ask residents if they even liked it. What did they like about it? What would they like to see us continue? What are some aspects that they'd like to see changed? And I spoke to several community leaders, and while I was talking to them, I had this sort of idea that popped in my head, like, why don't I record this? So I just started capturing some video of them telling, what they liked and didn't like about it. But ultimately, everyone said that they enjoyed the community arts activities and the fact that we were bringing in artists to perform and do different types of events. So we knew that we wanted to lean in that space and do more activities of that kind. So that's just sort of one way we do it. But I think in terms of, and this kind of builds on the question that you asked, Ben, around programming, we like to incorporate more than just installation style activities to help maintain a sense of sustainability. So like with the Photo Voice program, we not only did that program where we taught young people digital photography, which is now a skill that they can incorporate into their lives, but we also did a workshop with adult community members, and we partnered with local organizations to recruit those community leaders to participate in that training. And so it was a training that kind of was a crash course one-on-one around planning design terms, concepts and terms. And my hope was that it is an educational tool that they can then use for their future advocacy and organizing. So in that way, we do programming. And from a creative placekeeping and community arts standpoint, we don't just do installations, we also do a lot of educational workshops, cultural and historical walking tours. For example, that actually has been really popular. The community continues to ask for cultural and historical walking tours. So the hope is that we're passing on tools that community members can reuse and recycle in other aspects of their life.
I have like a related note to Ben's question. This is actually before my open box days as a researcher. I developed a series of workshops for high school students that we had them map places of belonging and inclusion within their school building. So it ended up being sort of a temperature map for them. And we also had some additional sort of workshops that leveraged that to the same concept of spatially and physically having students be able to articulate what that meant in physical environments. We thought it would be for students. Actually, the school district, and this was in Michigan, took those in their facilities department. So a host of facilities, I think representatives from the school district and the teachers facilitated their own exercise around these same workshops because they were trying to get into the mindset of a student in terms of talking about future improvements for their facilities. Which is kind of like a nice sort of oh, we intended it to be this one audience, but there was utility in them found that they told us that they don't think about things spatially. They don't think about physical environments as teachers in these spaces. So that was something that was a helpful tool that they were able to use, and we didn't have anything to do with it. They just took it and ran with it. And then to Jessica's question about post-occupancy and impacts, I can't disclose the project, but we're in pre-planning stages of we're having to be sort of a translator of what do you feel, what do you see, and what is happening between stages of design, construction, and then 5, 10, and 20 years. And that may be very physical interventions and projects that you can have evidence of benchmarks. But you start to see how people, we talk about stewardship, you see spaces that are cared for. You're starting to see sort of, people populate spaces. And so how we can start to articulate sort of different, like tangible and sort of experiential sort of aspects of benchmarks to success, and what we see as successful, both comes in a lot of different sort of qualities, but also how we starting to, take sort of the insights we learned from community members about sort of co-creating what those metrics may be in any sort of given context too.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to our speakers. We're so excited by this kind of discussion. We really wanted the three of you in particular to lead this topic because of the work that you do. I think evident in all of the presentations we've seen tonight is an interest and an excitement in the design of the engagement process itself, using a number of tools for co-design, from art performances, collage, collective model building, community-led exhibits. I think also quite instructive for me personally is sort of this evidence, the willingness to share these tools by empowering the communities and sort of demystifying the process, so to speak, right? Making, whether it's, giving people to tell their own stories or countless other examples. There's this definitely sort of making this, democratizing the process, if you will. I'm also optimistic. I feel like there are enough of us barbarians that have crossed the gates. That's why we're seeing RFPs with more intelligent language in them. Why we're seeing clients who are demanding or asking for more engaged and sustained community engagement. I'm not too rose tinted, my glasses, I hope, but I do think we'll move forward. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great panel discussion. Appreciate everyone's time. I want to respect by ending as close as we can to our 8 o'clock deadline. Alenza, Jen, Dan, amazing work. Keep up the good work. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me.
really appreciate it.
Really great discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you.